Picture this. The journey ahead starts here together, and together we can build a brighter future. You are listening to Illuminating Hope, a podcast of Hope House. Nancy McCormick has been in private practice at Unity since October of 2013. Before joining Unity, she accumulated 17 years of experience in domestic violence, working at Hope House and Rosebrooks. Additionally, she spent 5 years facilitating contract groups for individuals with substance use disorders and for family members of those affected by these disorders. Nancy firmly believes in the power of collaboration to address life's challenges. She understands that taking the first step, finding a counselor, and making the initial call can be the hardest part of the journey. She commends those who reach out for support and help. With many years of experience, Nancy has dedicated herself to assisting people in coping with the profound effects of addiction, both for the individuals struggling with the disease and for their families and loved ones. She has also devoted much of her career to supporting survivors of domestic violence. Nancy's goal is to build on her clients' strengths and empower them to overcome barriers, enabling them to achieve their life goals. She likens creating a successful life to assembling a jigsaw puzzle together. They find the right pieces to fit together to create a complete and fulfilling life. Hi, Nancy. Welcome to the Illuminating Hope podcast. Glad you're here.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm happy to be here.
So tell our listeners exactly what you do and what you specialize in.
I have a small private practice, and I meet with people who have substance use issues. I meet with the family members of people who have substance use issues, and I also work with people with domestic violence.
Tell me how substance abuse and domestic violence intersect.
A lot of ways. Where do I start? The range of connections that I've heard are people who are abused, people who are being controlled with substances. Someone wants them to stay under the influence because they're easier to control in that way. I've also heard of people who are using substances to try to numb out because the pain of the situation that they're in is so hard, and also the ones who are using because it keeps them in the relationship. If they're not ready to leave yet, it's like, this is how I can maintain and keep on going, is by using.
I think it's interesting because out of all of the questions that we get, I think people are so surprised and don't even know to ask that question because they don't realize that that is even a thing. So when people are thinking about substance abuse, they're often thinking of the abuser, at which we can talk about in a minute. But to think about that someone is using that because they're being forced to is a whole new concept to people. They just like, oh, I hadn't thought about it in that way.
Another way to control. Absolutely, another way to control. And when you talk about the abusers and they're using drugs or alcohol, some people make the great big assumption that the domestic violence or the abuse comes out of substance use. It does not. It absolutely does not. They're two separate things. And this is important for people to recognize because some people believe, well, if that abusive person quits using, then they'll be okay in the relationship, and that is not true.
And I think because it's often used as an excuse by the abuser as well.
Right.
Oh, if I wouldn't have been high, I wouldn't have done that. If I wouldn't have had, I had too many things to drink, so I wouldn't have been like that. But the reality is that the abusive behavior is there, and the alcohol and drugs just complicate it. Or has it been your experience that it increases the severity, or it increases the likelihood that it will happen sooner?
It accentuates it. I think it kind of pushes it forward more when they're using, because it removes our filters when we're under the influence. So more things may happen if you're under the influence than if you hadn't been.
What effects does a victim's substance abuse have on their ability to possibly seek help or leave a relationship?
I think probably the number one thing is their self-judgment or the shame that's attached to it. Maybe it is something about me and my behavior that's I don't deserve. Using substances changes our ability to make good decisions. It affects the part of the brain that helps us with brainstorming and solving issues. So it definitely would get in the way of someone making a choice. That by itself, that's kind of the brain chemistry part, but there's also the self-esteem part or the self-determination part that gets dampened by using substances because there's a piece of shame that goes along with it. Well, I can't do that. I can't fix this relationship. I can't get out of this, substance use. I think it's a real snowball thing that can accentuate.
It can also interfere when you have children. It's often used by the abuser as you are using, so you're not a good parent, and the kids will get taken away from you if you leave and you continue to use, which is often a valid threat because that is a possibility depending on how severe the use is. What would you say to someone in that situation who might come to you like, I don't want to leave because I'm going to lose my kids if I do?
I would walk them through the steps and look at it from different angles that they probably haven't thought about before. It's like, let's look at all the different options here and all the different things that could happen and steps to take to be prepared, to get ready for that happening, for leaving and what might happen. And many times this is a conversation that helps people start to make decisions about making good choices for themselves, preparing for that event when they're leaving to be in better shape and healthier.
What role does trauma play in the relationship between domestic violence and substance abuse?
Oh, it's so huge.
It's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, a whole lot to unpack. Trauma is what an awful lot of people are self-medicating for when they're using substances, and it runs very deep. And nobody can really get to that level to deal with the trauma when they're using substances. So it's really not even useful to start talking about trauma if someone's using until they get off of whatever it is that they're using and they feel capable enough and strong enough and have the resources enough to be able to deal with the trauma. In the meantime, it's kind of a harm reduction situation. Let's talk about how you can maybe manage this a little better until you are capable of being able to start to address the trauma.
Can you talk about that? Because that's something that we as an agency have gone to. When you provide 24-hour services to someone and you have community living, then the use of substances can be very problematic in that situation. That could trigger someone who's trying to stay clean and not use. You could be triggering to small children around you. But talk about what harm reduction means. I don't know that that's a term that a lot of people would be familiar with.
I think I became most familiar with that whole way of thinking during the pandemic because there was so much isolation and so much more rampant and extreme substance use during that time. It felt really wrong to say to anybody, you have to stop right now using. You have to stop using. What do you mean I'm isolated over here? I'm going to lose my mind. So working with people to help to try to manage that a little bit, it's like, how can we keep this within parameters where you're not going to die and you're not going to kill somebody else accidentally? It's a hard thing to do, but I think there's real benefit in figuring out how to do a little bit of management. And this goes so against what I was taught years ago in school. It's like, you got to quit. You got to stop doing it right now. And, I've moved so far away from that and recognize that you have to meet people where they are. If I say to somebody, you need to quit, then they're not ready. They will just walk out the door and I'll never see them again. Or if I say to somebody, you need to quit using when they're in a horribly hard situation, they think she doesn't understand the pain that I'm in. She has no idea what's happening over here, and she thinks I'm going to let go of the only coping skill I have.
You have no connection with that person, so no matter what you're doing, it's not going to make a difference because you've not connected with them
exactly
where they are. That is so critical.
Yeah.
I think that it's interesting because that was something that we had to do as well, that we had to come to that realization that just because you think everybody in this living in this situation should be free of using substances, yes, on some level that makes perfect sense, but if they're not there, then you're not able to connect with them and you're not going to be meeting their needs anywhere. So it is a manner of just being able to manage so that everybody stays safe.
Which is extremely difficult in a group living situation.
I agree.
Everybody's best interests have to be taken into consideration. Right. That means you can't make any hard and fast rules about substance use in community living.
Right.
You can't say, well, if you're under the influence, you're gone. Well, gone where? Right back into the dangerous situation or a worse situation? Yeah.
And it's the middle of the night, and what are you going to do? Just put somebody out on the street?
Right.
No, we're not going to do that. And it's also hard, I think, for staff to be able to know when doing substance abuse treatment is not their forte, it's not their expertise, so then them having to help make those kinds of decisions. So we do a lot of training with staff around where are those lines and what do you do in these situations, because it is really gray, because you can't predict every situation that's going to come your way. But it is about managing for the group as well. And sometimes you have to do what's better for the group, and it may not be the greatest thing for that particular individual. But there are times when you can manage for that individual and it's okay for the rest of the group too. So it is a matter of trying to figure out what do you do first. And it's hard to find priorities when you have this whole group of of people that you're trying to keep safe and manage.
Right. And I think it's also a time when people, the staff's history comes into play too. Mm-hmm. It's like, how have you been exposed before? Who have you been around? How much unhealed trauma from the past do you still have that causes you to say, absolutely not, you're out of here? That I think that happens sometimes, that we can bring our own history into it and make an assumption or react because of something that we've been through before. Right. With another person who's been a substance user.
Right. And the behaviors can be very scary too,
Absolutely.
Which can be triggering, whether they're coming from mental health issues or substance abuse use. It can be very difficult when somebody's presenting very high on whatever it is they're high on, and if they're acting out and being extreme, that can be really very difficult. Mm-hmm. And it can be traumatic for the people around. It can be very triggering.
Right.
For
so
people.
Even taking into consideration what substance are we talking about.
Correct.
That they're under the influence of. Right. Is important.
Right. That's one of the things that we think about too, because if somebody's coming off of alcohol, it will look a certain way. Or if you're coming down off of marijuana, that looks a certain way. Or if heroin or something that's stronger than that, the behaviors can be very different and they can be very scary.
And predictable.
Right. Mm-hmm. And not only for the people around them, but for that person too. You know, there could be medical issues that come around with that too. So it does take a lot of training, and it takes a lot of supporting staff around what's happening with them when those things are happening. I mean, you worked at Hope House for a period of time as our substance abuse counselor, and then you were at Rosebrooks for a period of time. So you really understand that connection between domestic violence and substance abuse.
Woven in together, but they also exist separate from each other and have to be treated separately as separate issues, many times at the same time. It's not complicated at all.
I was thinking about that too, because you have to decide with that person what they're going to focus on. And that's part of the harm reduction too, I believe. That if you decide that this trauma over here needs more immediate attention, then you're going to balance what you can on the other end with whatever substances are happening.
To me, that is so entirely driven by the client's choice. I may be sitting in my chair and thinking, boy, we got to dive right into whatever, but they're saying, no, I think I want to just talk about this little thing that's going on over here. And that's another way of developing the rapport and bonding with somebody, is letting them judge what is most important. It might be the best thing for them to start with in that area. So kind of going back to that philosophy that the person holds the wisdom for themselves and they know the best path. So trusting that and saying, okay, we'll start where you say.
How can we as an organization better educate our community and society as a whole on the subject of how substance abuse and domestic violence intersect?
That's a really big question. I'm not sure I have the answer. I think whenever people get together and have kind of open conversation about topics, a lot of questions come up that maybe are important for the community to know, and that might be one place to start, is just to have a forum. Maybe it is a table of people who you have someone who's in recovery and someone who has been doing counseling, providing counseling for the substance abusers. Maybe it is doing a variety of people that can just educate the community about what this is all about, because I think there is a whole lot of lack of knowledge about what's going on and why can't they just stop, which is true of both substance abuse and domestic violence. Why don't they just leave? Why didn't they just stop using? Oh, you have no idea, people, but if you could hear a little bit more, the people who are talking who have been there, you might get a little clearer picture of what it really means. So I don't know what the big answer is there. Maybe it starts with just a little bit of information in a forum that might then segue into the next step and what else would be good for people to know and how they could be more compassionate and understanding and less judgmental.
I think that's a conversation we have regularly with people around domestic violence. That whole question of why doesn't she leave, and responding to that with, well, why does he continue to abuse?
Exactly.
Let's look at that behavior. As a substance abuse professional, though, how much education is out there for people in your field around domestic violence? You have that because of your experience of working in the two agencies. Is that common educational material for someone who's in the substance use as a therapist or counselor?
I believe, and I'm not sure what's going on in the schools these days, how holistic they are about looking at that issue, because in my opinion, when there's substance use involved, there's a whole ball of stuff that could be included in the issues that someone brings to the table. But I'm not sure if they're getting very deep education or understanding about domestic violence, or if they are still kind of on the edge of, well, if you get yourself out of that situation, or why don't you get yourself out of that situation and then things will be fine. But I mean, what's true about substance use is that there are a whole lot of other dysfunctions that are typically present in someone's life if they've had that issue for any length of time. So there's usually a whole lot of stuff to unpack. Like I say, I don't know how much education they're doing now about it. I remember way back when Terry and we did a presentation for Combat on how the intersection between substance abuse and domestic violence were, and people were like, wow, this is new stuff. That was kind of eye-opening, that people didn't know what was going on between those two different dynamics and what you're looking at in terms of trying to address.
Have you ever treated somebody simultaneously unpacking both the substance abuse and the domestic violence, and what was a picture of that? How did that look if you did?
I think it's really tricky, and I guess I would go back to the harm reduction thing in both areas and say, let's figure out, first of all, how can you be safe? And being safe regarding both of those things. Being safe, are you still in the relationship or have you gotten away? Are there any risks that remain because of that? Because I think a person has to feel safe before they can begin to heal. Being safe in terms of abuse or violence, and then also looking at what would constitute feeling safe around substances too. How can we figure this out so that you don't feel like you're being taken away immediately from the coping skill that you've had for so long, but is there a way to maintain some kind of healthiness or, safety in that too? Can we incorporate a little bit of new coping skills so that maybe you go to this step, and then the third step is, then I'm going to have a drink. Whatever I'm going to do to start to kind of incorporate some other steps that could be options, because I think that's the thing a lot of people feel when they've been using substances. This is all I have. This is what works, and this is all I have. And so incorporating some new techniques for them to try. At the same time, you're talking about some very difficult stuff. So it is a really gentle stepping into this kind of process. Yeah, dealing with trauma can really trigger people, which, could make them want to use more. I think it all has to go so slowly. And a lot of that, once again, I think can be guided by them. What pace is okay for them? What feels all right to them? How quickly to move?
Have you ran into cultural barriers when it comes to stigma of substance abuse, domestic violence?
I have. I can't think of a stigma that I have run into regarding domestic violence, but I do think of people I've worked with who have had substance use and some cultural stigma that has been attached there. That is just another level of shame that is attached to the behavior that they need to talk about and recognize and roll that into the ball of stuff, or pull that out of the ball, I guess is what it is, of things that they're dealing with. The vat of shame is deep.
I can imagine that would just add another layer.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I mean, the shame that we see people struggling with around domestic violence is huge, and then you add substance use on top of that, or it just complicates it. As you're talking, I'm thinking about people who are struggling with these two issues, and thinking about what does it take to have the strength, the ability, the willpower, the determination to keep going, because you just keep unpacking all this stuff. That's so hard. Do you find that people get stuck along the way and that you have to help them to get unstuck? This is not easy work. Doing one or the other is not easy, but when you combine them, I think it's even harder.
Yeah, I do too. And I think there's some times when in the process you kind of have to push the pause button and say, okay, well, they're about at their capacity right now, and maybe it's time to just really rely on some of those self-care behaviors to sort of get yourself back into a good place. Maybe take a little vacation from the hard work for a minute, because it is a lot. I had a new client that I started with the other day who was talking about everything that she'd had to deal with in the last 2 years. And my beginning of talking with her is eating right and sleeping and drinking water. I mean, really basic survival stuff that people don't think about very much, but it's so important, because that's another thing about being in a situation, either of those situations. You don't think about self-care. You're not thinking about what's best for me and how could I be healthier. So many times dealing with either subject matter, it is about starting with the baseline of, let's figure out how you can feel physically better, and that's going to help you move move towards feeling emotionally, mentally, spiritually better.
I think that's really key. We know that just when you're talking about domestic violence, it takes an average of 7 times for someone to leave before they can leave for good because of all the obstacles that get in their way. And then that only gets even more complicated when you add substance use on top of it to try to not be an obstacle in your way as well.
Right.
So it is just so complicated.
If there are any medical professionals that are listening to this podcast to ensure that their clients receive comprehensive care, what would you tell them?
To make sure that they're well educated about, I'm assuming we're talking about the domestic violence more than the substance use. Typically, they have more education in the substance use area. Not all the time.
Right.
But to ask the questions and to become educated enough that they can maybe see some of the signs even before the person answers questions. You can read so much into people by their body language, their eye contact, their, so many things that would be really beneficial if they could tune into those and say, looks like maybe you, and help them to feel comfortable about talking about things that are going on with them. I know that a lot of the hospitals and doctors' offices have the signs up now that say, if this is happening. And even my own doctor, the last time I went for a physical, said, is your situation safe? Do you ever feel like you're threatened? That's good. I don't know if sometimes they ask that question and they zip right through it and then it's like, well, she said no. But did she say no? Did you notice how she looked when she said no? Was there maybe with a little more encouragement or creating space for that, could a person have talked a little bit more? When somebody is in that situation, they typically feel like there's no place I can go and there's nobody I can talk to, and that could be because of their own shame. It could be because the person who is controlling them has cut them out of any relationships that they have. So we kind of have to look about what are the options then? Where are the places that, and then people always go to the doctor. Well, not always, but they should go to the doctor more probably, but they do go to the doctor, and that is a prime place that more conversation could happen about what's going on and how they could obtain help.
And going back to your earlier comment about during COVID, that was cut off. Those opportunities for people to connect was cut off. And that's what we were seeing, is that we had to be creative about how we were reaching people, because those avenues that had usually been the referral sources weren't there anymore because everyone was isolated in their own homes. And I agree there was an increase in substance use during that time. We also saw an increase in the severity of the abuse that people were experiencing. There was no one there to monitor or to assist. So I think that it is extremely important that we take the time to listen and to talk with people, and to those nonverbal cues can be so crucial in a situation, especially if that abuser's anywhere near.
Absolutely.
Which I know they've gotten to where they are much better about separating and having those conversations with someone alone. I don't think you can emphasize enough how important those, because that could be that person's only contact because of what's going on. And if that person's not tuned in and not paying attention, then key things are going to get lost.
When you say that, it makes me think of the times when the abusive person is in on the doctor's appointment and the other one's there and they're answering the questions. And if the person who's asking the questions could key in and see some kind of change in their how they look, or some body language that changes, prime time for them to say, I need you to step out of the room for a moment because I need to do this exam, which, is kind of private or whatever. A way to get that person out of the room for just a second,
right,
to be able to say, I noticed that your eyes did this different thing when I said this. And I just want to give you a little time if you want to tell me anything else about that.
And even if it's not at that moment, you've planted that seed.
Right.
We were at an event on this weekend, and we had a former client speak, and she talked about that. She talked about how important it was that that person connected with her, and she said it was the first time she had somebody listen, but also somebody who believed her. And
that's huge.
It was huge.
That just gives me chills.
I know. It was life-changing for her, and it was in the hospital setting that had happened. It was one of our advocates that had gone out and responded, but that was so key that they keyed in and they listened. They took the time to listen, and they believed her. And that to know that no one had believed her up until this point.
Yeah.
It's just, that can be so crucial to pay attention to those nonverbal.
It's the magic moment.
It
I
is.
call it the magic moment when when those kinds of things happen, or when a person who has been in and out of substance use forever finally says, okay, I'm ready now. Where do I start? And it doesn't make any sense why this time is the time and it wasn't 5 times ago or whatever, but it's the magic moment. It's the perfect lining up of the planets for something positive to happen.
Right, and you don't know how many times, as a professional in the field, none of us know how many times we're going to say something, or how we say something, or what it is we say is going to make that connection for them. You just keep doing it, knowing that you've planted that seed. It will take root somewhere, somehow, some way, and you may not be around. You may not be the one that sees the result of it, but it will happen at some point when that person's ready. And then we need to be available when that person's ready. It's like, okay, now you're ready, so
Let's go.
Yeah.
What's the average length of time that you see a client?
Wow.
That's a good question.
That is a good question. I wish somebody could answer. I know that I've had people that I have been seeing for 5 or 6 years, maybe a couple even longer than that. It just depends so much on what the issue is. And those people who are longer, it probably is related to trauma, I'm going to guess. A lot of it going back to childhood issues and things that are still, wounds that are still being healed from back then. Now, I have had, sometimes I will work with a family member of somebody with an addiction, and we move through that, and then they come back again because there's another family member who now has an addiction. So I get repeat customers. People come back to talk again about similar issues. But that's a really good question. I should go back sometime and kind of take more of a look of what the average length of time is.
That can be hard to answer for us as well, because it's so varied. It just is really varied. Depends on what their needs are and what their issues are.
Yeah, and it depends on how deep a person wants to go too. I mean, some people just want to do a little bit of work right now that helps them kind of function better on a daily basis, and maybe later is when they want to go a little deeper to address some issues that are not so surface related. Yeah, I'm going through my head now thinking about all these people. It's like, oh my gosh, I don't know. It's a very hard question to answer.
So going back, it's related to that, but also going back to the harm reduction. Is ultimately the goal for the clients that you're seeing or have seen, like through our programs, is it ultimately to stop using, or do they have other goals, or do you hope that at some point that's what everybody's working towards?
In my head, I believe that's the best option. It has the greatest insurance of a future that doesn't have disaster in it. And I tell people this, I'm willing to go with their plan if they come into me and they say, I really want to just cut down on my using. I think that maybe I can figure out how to control this, and then I can keep on doing it. And I will tell them, I haven't had a ton of success with this, but I am happy to help you move in that direction, because I am not going to say 100% it won't work. You may be the person who figures out the formula and is able to do this. So let's see how we can proceed in that way. Let's start moving in that direction and see how we end up. And there are some times when people realize that it doesn't work very well, or they realize that they're putting themselves in a greater level of pain, having to think about it all the time, which that's, I think, a real common thing. So then I have to think, am I drinking tonight? Am I not drinking tonight? How many am I going to have? How do I make sure I'm not going to have any more than that? And what time can I start? And so many questions and so much time devoted to that. It's really easier to just say, I'm not going to do it. But if they're not in that place yet and they're not ready, it's like, okay, we are going to go down the path the way you want to. I actually worked with somebody a few years ago, and I wish I would have checked in with him further after the time that I saw him, because he was one of those people who said a similar thing. And he said, I think I have these guidelines and I have these rules, and I think if I do this and this and this, that I will be successful. And as far as I know, he was. And it seemed to work. Now, is it still working? I don't know. And that may be the difference between someone who is way into the dependence area and somebody who is just kind of in the problematic area. Because once you cross over the line, it gets really hard to do any kind of control, which, it usually steps back to where you used to be. It's sneaky.
So what kind of tools do you have people put in their toolboxes to maybe build a little bit more resiliency
for
either domestic violence or substance.
Okay,
yeah.
I really start talking with everybody about the same basic survival stuff with the eating and how you sleeping, what's your schedule like, and what kind of food are you eating, are you drinking water, lots of caffeine or sugar or whatever. And I also talk to people about exercise because I think it's a wonderful way to reduce stress and also, increase the brain chemistry functioning. So even to just get people started in that area is a good thing. I love journaling because it helps with that, internal dialogue that they can have. I work with people all the time about their negative self-talk. This is so pervasive. Everybody has terrible demons in their head trying to tell them lies. And I say this, those are lies. It's not the truth. So let's start looking at those and figuring out what the truth is so that you can, when those thoughts pop up, talk back to them and go, no, that's not what I'm going to believe about myself. There are a whole lot of skills in terms of having your phone of friends. I call them phone of friends because in both of these issues, substance use and domestic violence, people usually get pretty isolated. And so they have not been used to asking for help or connecting with people. So I say, start practicing using your phone of friends. You can let people know, I'd like to sign you up as a phone of friend. If you wouldn't mind, my therapist says I need to start practicing this, or it would be good for me to start practicing this. So I'd like to just call you and use you in case there's a day when I really need you. So being able to connect with people in a healthy way and start to build kind of a social network of some kind. That's a slow process, but those are the things that pop into my head first.
That stress reduction is just so important to do. And there's so many ways that you can do that. I think, exercise clearly a big one, meditation, yoga, some of those things, just to help people and breathing. How many times do we not breathe? That we just don't take the time, if we could just settle in and go, okay, I can make it through this moment or whatever we're dealing with at that moment. So,
Tools to deal with anxiety, huge. Absolute necessity. Absolute necessity.
Is there anything that you'd like to bring up before we sign off today?
I'm happy that you're doing this. I'm happy that you have this podcast. And this is a way to educate people like we were talking about what will help the community. And this is one of those ways that people can learn more. And then maybe their opinions about things change a little bit, or their mind opens up a little bit, or they're a little more compassionate when they understand more about what's going on. So I think this is really good that you're doing this.
I would love to see society just be more curious about why things are happening, why people act the way they do, and it could be because of a lot of past trauma. I sure appreciate you coming on today, Nancy. Thank you so much for being here.
You're welcome. Thank you for inviting me.